Hi, everyone. Good Tuesday afternoon, and welcome to GoLocal Live. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel. Thanks for tuning in for the News and Politics show this afternoon. And want to thank our Tuesday regular Jennifer Lawless, Professor of Political Science down at the University of Virginia, for Skyping in. Thank you, Jennifer.
Of course.
Well, so much to break down. Let's start at the top. Let's talk a little bit about the prospects of the Senate taking up either what was the House language or amended language pertaining to President Trump's declaration of a national emergency. Now, we saw the House basically rebuke that call. Now it goes to the Senate. It looks like they've got the Republicans to do so as well on the Senate side.
Right. There are definitely at least 4 senators who have already committed to signing on to the Democratic House legislation. Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, who are not surprises, Tom Tillis from North Carolina, and Rand Paul from Kentucky, who are usually not engaged in bipartisanship. And there are at least 10 other senators who have considered it or who haven't opposed the idea of signing on. So the question becomes whether Mitch McConnell will put this up for a vote. The challenge, of course, is that in neither house, neither chamber, are there enough votes to override a presidential veto. But the question then becomes whether Donald Trump has the authority not only to skirt Congress on this, but then to veto legislation that rebukes him.
And let's talk about what that looks like if that happens. As you said, probably don't have the votes for a veto again if the Senate does now. So president goes for a veto, don't have the votes for a veto override. Is this just uncharted territory? I mean, then what?
It is uncharted because the question ultimately comes down to appropriations, and Congress constitutionally is given the power of the purse. That's where appropriations bills begin, and they're ultimately assigned the responsibility of determining what we spend money on. Mm-hmm. So this executive order, by definition, given that it's allocating funds, is already shaky. But overriding a congressional effort that says, look, we've thought about it and you can't do this, is almost sure to generate a Supreme Court decision.
And so you talk about generating a Supreme Court decision. Oftentimes we know the wheels of justice don't turn that quickly. How protracted could this get?
I think this is one of those cases where the Supreme Court would act pretty quickly because it's clear that they would have original jurisdiction, I think, over a case like this. It's not like a lower court would be suing the president. It would be a congressional committee doing it, in which case the court could hear it very, very quickly. The question is whether it's in their interest to do so. Do they really want to be in a position right now where they probably cast the kind of partisan vote that we saw in Bush v. Gore, where it further undermines separation of powers and the institutional integrity of the court?
How soon could we expect Mitch McConnell to move on this?
With Mitch McConnell, it's tricky because traditionally he does not move forward with legislation unless he knows that he has the votes. In this case, he knows for sure that he does not have the votes that are needed to block the House legislation. The question becomes whether they can actually take up an amended form of this. And that's an open question as well. We're completely in uncharted territory there.
So let's go to the other side of the Capitol. Let's talk about the House Judiciary probe. The number of people on that list, the announcement today of the call for the president's tax returns. And am I mistaken, was Ivanka Trump not on that list?
She was not on the list. Eric and Don Jr. were, except my understanding is that she's on another list, and one that is likely to also generate requests, if not for documents, then certainly for testimony. But basically, anybody that has ever met Donald Trump should be wondering whether they're going to get a letter from the House Judiciary Committee.
It's that expansive.
It really is. I mean, so far it's 81 of his closest friends, most of whom probably no longer consider themselves close friends. So this is an example of oversight. I think it's also an example of what happens when for 2 years there's virtually no oversight. It's pretty unheard of to issue requests for documents from such a long list of people. But keep in mind that over the course of the last 2 years, when the Republicans had control of the House, they were providing virtually no oversight and asking for virtually nothing in the way of documents. So it's important to provide that perspective. This is what happens when you've been sitting on something for a very, very long time.
Let's talk a little bit about what's happening in the House as well. Rep. Omar, who we spoke about just a couple weeks ago now, with some comments she made on certain legislators' relationships with Israel. Now, the House taking up a measure this week, not particularly pertaining to Representative Omar, but I guess language sort of in general. And then, of course, we saw AOC come to Rep. Omar's defense about that this week as well. What do we see happening with this, especially now with the call for action on the House side?
Well, we've reached a point in time now where it's clear that the House, the Democrats in the House in particular, are concerned about any sort of semblance of anti-Semitic rhetoric or perceptions of anti-Semitism, or signaling that their new liberal progressive members are far more pro-Palestinian than they might be pro-Israeli. And as a result, we are seeing a high level of scrutiny, not only in what we saw with the tweet a couple of weeks ago, where there were anti-Semitic tropes used and stereotypes invoked, but also just the other day. Now, the interesting thing here is that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said that it's fine to call out anti-Semitism, but it's a little bit striking that when there are other allegations against other types of groups, there doesn't seem to be a chamber that's nearly as up in arms. And she referred in a tweet to the fact that she was told to go back to Puerto Rico. And there didn't seem to be any sort of uproar regarding that. So I think the Democrats are finding themselves in a position where if they are going to call out their members, they probably have to do it a little bit more broadly than they currently are. That said, I don't think there's anything to suggest that they haven't acted appropriately when it comes to, snuffing out anti-Semitism.
One of the things that AOC had mentioned as well was one of her colleagues calling into line Rep. Omar's even questioning of the American-Israeli relationships amongst them, and that she took to task that when does it become all of a sudden wrong to question? Is it again the nuance and the delivery of how Rep. Omar had sort of made these accusations?
I think the delivery and the tone matter. I also think that if the tweet from a couple of weeks ago had not set the stage for this general sense that maybe there's some underlying anti-Semitism, the reaction to this particular incident probably wouldn't have been as, loud as it was.
Let's talk a little bit, a couple more topics. I want to catch you on while we have you here. The Democratic candidate palooza for 2020, if you will. Seeing John Hickenlooper get into the race as well as Jay Inslee. And I know you keep saying Biden's the wild card, but how big is this field going to grow?
Well, I have to tell you that while you were just speaking, I can break some breaking news. Politico broke it, but I just saw it. Mike Bloomberg has announced that he will not run.
Okay.
So in the last 2 days, Mike Bloomberg and Hillary Clinton have both taken themselves out of the running. I still think that Joe Biden remains the wild card, but when we think about Inslee or Hickenlooper, as we get more and more of these candidates, I think there are two dynamics that become tricky for everyone. The first is, how do you break through? People don't know who they are, and frankly, governors have a harder time building national name recognition than senators because they're known very well in one state, but rarely do other states cover what the chief executive of a neighboring or a state across the country is doing. And so that's tricky for both Inslee and Hickenlooper. But the second factor is, how do you break through a crowd and differentiate yourself when pretty much all of these candidates are very, very similar when it comes not only to thinking that the country will be better off without Donald Trump as president, but also the issues that they care about. There are differences in terms of which issues they're prioritizing, but if you were to look at the top 5 or 6 concerns of all of them, there would be a very, very high level of correlation.
To talk about that Joe Biden wild card as the anticipation continues to mount as to whether he will or won't, we've seen across the country any number of polls that question whether Americans want a president or a presidential candidate of a certain age. How big is the age card?
I mean, you can get people to say that they're worried about things hypothetically, but it's very difficult to then see how that translates. So, Bernie Sanders falls into that category too, yet he's polling at the top of a lot of these lists. So, people are concerned about age. All else equal, they would probably like somebody younger, but all else is not equal. And if Joe Biden is perceived as having the best shot at defeating Donald Trump, if he's perceived as being the person who can sort of right this ship and bring us back to the good old days of the Obama administration, if he's perceived as somebody who can go to Wisconsin and Minnesota and Pennsylvania and Michigan and make sure that working class voters cast Democratic ballots, then sure, everybody would prefer it if he was 55, but at the end of the day, I don't think it's going to matter.
And finally, let's go back to last weekend, which folks are still talking about. President Donald Trump's unscripted, off-the-cuff remarks at CPAC.
I mean, I have to say that if viewers have 2 hours and 12 minutes to kill, I really think this is an amazing way to spend it. Because there are so many things that happened during that speech that epitomize what this administration believes and the tone in which they've advocated for their principles. And it's, I think, very, very worrisome. You know, just days after Donald Trump said that he was going to take Kim Jong-un at his word, he then goes on stage and says that there are members of Congress who are Democrats who don't love our country and who don't want to do the right thing. And so those kinds of juxtapositions, I think, are pretty shocking. And he also did it in a way where he was a little bit unhinged, not only because he literally embraced the American flag, like physically, but also because of the language that he used. I mean, it's not, you know, the audience was not a PG audience.
Well, we have plenty to look forward to. Unfortunately, we are going to miss you next week because colleges do go on spring break and it's UVA's turn. But we do appreciate, as always, you're taking the time to Skype up to us here in Providence. We look forward to catching up with you in the near future. Jennifer Lawless at UVA, thank you so much.
Of course.
Okay, don't go anywhere. We're going to get a little more local here. We're going to talk writing with Dr. Ed Iannicelli. Weekly contributor on GoLocal is going to pop right here in studio in just a moment, so don't go anywhere.